Hi, good morning, everybody, and welcome to What to Do if your child with an IEP is falling behind in school. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to come in and get settled before we start with polls. And let's see. So the rules for today, pretty simple. If you have a question, please enter the question in the Q&A feature, which should be a button either at the top or the button of your screen. We will be answering questions at designated times, but also throughout the presentation as times come up. And let's launch the first poll. I'll take care of that one. All right. So for those of you who are coming in, welcome again. I just launched a poll, which is just attendee information. I appreciate to know who's here. And again, this is what to do if your child with an IEP is falling behind in school. Please enter your questions in the Q&A. We'll be answering those questions in writing and later taking those questions probably verbally as we go along. And we always get this question. So for starters, we will send a copy of all the slides to you. So you will have copies of the slides. And if you're watching this recorded in the future, you can always email us at advocatesforchildren.org, and we can also send you the slides in that way. All right.
I think I'm actually pretty sure that on our YouTube site where this will get posted, there's a link underneath for the slides as well, or there should be.
Even better.
Hopefully can access it there. We have a lot of links, as Liana just said, in the slides, so that helps. You can't obviously click on them now, but once you get a copy of it, you can. All right, it looks like Brooklyn and Queens are neck and neck. Oh, actually, yeah.
Any Staten Island? Not yet. Not yet. All right, let's give it a couple more questions. And while we do that, let's introduce ourselves. So hello, I'm Liliana Diaz-Pedrosa. I'm the director of the AFC Parent Center, and I'll be conducting part of the presentation. On the Q&A, we have Karen Herrera, who is our Parent Center advocate, and
I'm Kim Madden. I'm the Director of Family Support at Advocates for Children. And welcome. We know this is, we had a lot of questions beforehand. We will try to cover them, but if we don't, please put your questions in the Q&A and we'll get to them. We're going to have a few breaks. We are going to try to do it in an hour. We may run a little bit over, but we'll stay around for questions afterwards as well.
All right, I think I'm going to end this poll. All right. And so most of you are parents. Yay, parents, and professionals, of course, but most of you are parents. And it looks like almost every borough is represented today. So welcome, everybody. And then let's get started. Okay, let's talk about today's training. Are you on the? Yes, you are. Okay, awesome. All right, so today just a brief introduction, and we'll talk a little bit about why is your child behind. Then we will go into COVID recovery services, the IEP, and finally problem solving. So as introduction, and I know some people are just rolling in right now, so a reminder that we will offer copies of the presentation emailed later. And let's see. We have one more poll. I'm going to launch it right now while we talk about Advocates for Children. The poll is your child in? Or are you working with a child in elementary, middle, high school, over 21 or other? So Advocates for Children, for those of you who are not familiar with us, is an independent agency that protects the rights of all New York City public students. We work on every issue that has to do with education in New York City. Most of the information that we offer is around special education, school suspensions, but also how to navigate the school system, from how to apply to kindergarten, middle school, and high school, to what do you need to do to graduate from high school, what are the criteria, and anything in between. We have some main services, including our helpline, which runs 4 days a week, Monday through Thursday from 10 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. The number is 1-866-427-6033. It's a toll-free number. And although we're working remotely, we are answering the phones during those hours. And believe me, a lot of people are calling, so we hope that you guys also have questions and call us. We have a wide assortment of guides and resources from early intervention to aging out of school and everything in between on our website at advocatesforchildren.org. We offer free workshops and trainings and free legal services to families of low income around issues that have to do with education in New York City, specifically with the New York City Department of Education. We get a question about, are we part of the Department of Education? No, we work very closely with them. Of course, we're sort of frenemies, if you will. We offer a lot of support to families who have children in the New York City public school system. We have, I think we should go to the next slide. We have archived most of our webinars, if not all, on our YouTube page, where, as Kim mentioned earlier, you can find links to materials. We like the webinar feature particularly because you can really watch the information at a later time, and you can scroll through to the part that you really want to hear again. But please feel free to go to our YouTube page and take a look to find information that you need. All right, I'm going to close this poll. Thank you for those who entered the information. We have a lot of people who have children or work with children in the elementary school level. Yeah, followed by middle school and high school. Wonderful, thank you. All right. Okay, so first I want to tell you where you can find some information about latest assessments, IEP, and student support. So for those of you who don't have the My Student account, the New York City student account, which is a parent portal account, you just enter your, create an account with your email address and a creation code that's provided by your school. Once you log into this portal, you can find the most recent assessments, the copies of the most recent IEPs, information about your student academic supports, including any services that have been offered because of COVID, so recovery services, and very importantly, transportation, which you'll see right where the bus is, right at the in the lower row. You don't have an account and like to create one, ask a parent coordinator at your school or a school administrator to help you. The Department of Education has transitioned pretty quickly into an online platform, so this would be your main way of getting information at this point and going forward. We can certainly answer questions about that later on.
Yeah, and the one piece I would jump in on is the student academic supports is supposed to show special education recovery services, at least in a very informal, small size poll that we did at Advocates for Children. We found it was about 50% correct. So if it doesn't list everything there, talk to your school. It may be that your child is getting something and it's not showing up there.
All right, let's go to the next one. Thank you. All right, so let's get to the heart of it. So why is your child behind? And let's try to figure out ways to problem solve. So what happened? Let's go to the next one. So we're going to cover some special education recovery services from the pandemic. We know that during the pandemic, a lot of things happened. Either your child fell behind during the pandemic because they were not getting appropriate program or services that were recommended on the IEP, or they needed other programs or services, or you're not quite sure and there is a need for evaluations to determine what happened. So if your child didn't get the programs and services or the IEP, go up the chain of command. So ask the Department of Education to implement the IEP, to provide the services that were listed on the IEP, even if those services were listed in the last IEP for last year, and you believe that they didn't get it then, they are still entitled to get those services. And we will discuss escalating a little bit towards the end. If your child now needs other programs or services, we will go through types of programs and services that are typically available. The one thing you might need to remember is that you need to make those requests in writing for other programs or services. And the same thing, if your child was not getting the programs or services that were listed on the IEP, making sure that you're making these requests in writing becomes really important at this point. And then finally, where do we go from here? I think you have to click one more so that the now what comes up. There you are. So where do we go from here? So how do we learn about how far behind your child might be, what type of services they need now? What is it that needs to happen for your child to be able to go to be where they were supposed to be had they received appropriate programs and services in a timely fashion. We will go through evaluations now, but the first step and really the most basic step to find out where your child should be and what services they need is really truly to get a full evaluation in all areas of suspected disability. So far, so good. Everyone with me?
You want to launch
Okay.
that poll? I think this is the,
Is there a poll here?
yep. Oh,
Ah, yes, it is. You're right. Sorry about that. So the poll, do you have a My Student account? And finally, I think my child is behind because, and then mark as many as you need, either because they fell behind in the pandemic or they were not getting program and services or the IEP on the IEP, and or they need other programs or services, or you don't know. And by the way, you don't know is a very fair place to be. And that's why the evaluations are so important. For those who have questions right now, please enter the questions in the Q&A. We will have opportunities to answer those questions as we go along, but we're not going to be turning on the audio feature just yet because it is a recording and we want to make sure that we preserve information in a safe manner.
okay, it looks like we have a lot of fell behind in the pandemic, which is not surprising. It's a big part of why we wanted to do this training.
That's right. All right, let's end the poll. Thanks for reminding me, Kim. And all right, so let's get into the evaluations, which is the next slide. Okay, Kim, I think you need to flip over to the next one. Okay. All right, here you are, sorry. Okay, so for those of you who have worked with the Department of Education's special education system, you may be familiar with the process of how to obtain free evaluations as part of the IEP process, right? But for those of you who haven't, the Department of Education, parents have the right to request free evaluations in all areas of suspected disabilities whenever they have, whenever their child is experiencing difficulty to determine whether or not there is a condition or a disability that impacts their learning, and that would then create the foundation for eligibility in special education services. Evaluations have to be free and up to every 3 years, but up to once a year. So what that means is that every 3 years, the Department of Education, if there's an open special education case, has the obligation to restart the special education cycle and create new evaluations with parental consent. But evaluations tend to be good for 3 years. After 3 years, they're not considered to be accurate. However, a parent does not have to wait 3 years to get an evaluation. If you believe your child needs additional testing, updated testing, new testing, you can request an evaluation when you believe you need one. And the Department of Education must conduct it for free up to the same one once a year. So you might not want to have the very same evaluation twice a year because it's not going to yield accurate results. And so the Department of Education might decline to evaluate at that point. But in general, when you request an evaluation, the Department of Education should conduct that evaluation with limited exceptions. You have a right to copies of those evaluations. And if you have a child who's an emergent bilingual, someone who is an English language learner, the Department of Education should test in their native language in as much as possible, certainly if their native language is Spanish, or use a cascade of, well, actually that's actually complicated, or use interpreters offered by the Department of Education that are trained to work with evaluators to be able to elicit the information necessary to know what their needs are. This is true also for students who are nonverbal. There are nonverbal tests that can be offered, and the Department of Education has plenty of experience doing this to ensure that the evaluations reflect the students' true abilities and needs. If your child needs testing in a particular way because they use communication devices or because they have other ways, different disabilities, Certainly, there's a level of creativity that the Department of Education has to use and the evaluators have to use to be able to get the information needed to determine need. But just know that this is something that they are typically able to do, and that you can count on. I don't know if you want to add anything else to that, Kim. Not so far? Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So what should an evaluation include? So typically, evaluations have a common battery of tests that the Department of Education offers, but you should also know that the Department of Education is charged to offer free Department of Education evaluations in all areas of suspected disability. So that means that even if the Department of Education does not offer an evaluation in their basic battery of tests, if you believe that your child requires additional testing in a different area, you can request it. I'll give you some examples in just a minute. So the typical evaluations include a social history, which is it's an interview with the parent or primary care provider to look at the developmental histories, areas of concerns, family history, to identify areas of concern, but also areas that may require additional evaluation. In the social history is where the school social worker usually tells you about your parental rights or your due process rights, and other information that you need to be able to preserve your child's rights through the special education system. There's also a psychoeducational evaluation, a classroom observation, a recent physical, so usually within 1 year, and you can provide that, and any other areas of concerns. Now, vocational assessment is usually required for students who are over the age of 18, but you can start getting it as early as age 12 as per your request. Let's talk about additional evaluations in the next slide. So you can ask for specific evaluations if you think these are needed. So for example, occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech or language therapy, an evaluation for assistive technology. And assistive technology is any device, tool that might assist the student in the classroom to be able to participate fully. So it could be a communication device like the iPad, it could be books with big font or slanted desks, the FM unit for students who have sensory or auditory needs and require something to help them listen to the information more clearly. There are so many fidgets to help students with who need it to be able to participate in class. And that's a separate evaluation that you can request if you believe your child needs it. There's also the functional behavioral assessment, which looks at behavior, challenging behavior when it happens, looks at what triggers it, and it is used then to create a behavior intervention plan, sort of like a roadmap. So for the teacher to be able to follow along and address the behaviors in a way that an evaluation has already looked at, instead of trying to guess how to address the behavior, they already have information about what is recommended to as an intervention for specific behaviors that have been identified. And then finally, the vocational assessments, level 2 or level 3. So these are questionnaires about skills and interests that help students narrow down what their post-secondary goals might be. So level 2 vocational assessment is more evaluation of strengths and interests to help in transition planning. It's a formal assessment with hands-on activities. Thank you. It takes a little bit of time. It takes a minimum of 3 to 5 hours. And the level 3 vocational assessment is more comprehensive. That it's an assessment that uses work, real or simulated situations as the basis for the assessment. It is a minimum of 10 days long. So if you have an older child and you're interested in these assessments, you can make a request again in writing so that you can look at that information. Now, these assessments are incredibly important at this point, because if your child has fallen behind because of lack of instruction or lack of appropriate services during COVID, it may be that the impact of the delay in getting services is being greater than the actual delay. So things compounds. If you lost 3 months of speech therapy, for example, the delay may not be a 3-month delay, it might be greater, it might be less. And so you need these evaluations, or you may need these evaluations to take a look at, well, how far behind is my child now because of these delays? Do they need more services, twice as many services as before? Or was the original rate of services that my student was getting sufficient to be able to make up the time lost if now we start getting services, or do we need something else? So I would encourage all of you who are worried about your child's current level and of progress to make a request for these evaluations or additional evaluations as needed, just to start fresh and get a ground level view of what needs to happen next. Now let's take a look at the next slide. And Kim, did you want to add anything there?
No, there was one, well, I guess one question that came in is it problematic to use DOE evaluations? That's a tough question to answer. I would say, a psychologist that I used to work with, a private psychologist, said that it's not that there's something wrong with the DOE evaluations. I mean, there can be, but per se, there's not a problem with it. It's just that they're a very blunt instrument. So they can highlight general problems. For some students, you may need something that's more nuanced. Which is a lot of times why we are helping parents get the independent assessment authorization, or trying to find private evaluators. Certainly for parents with resources, they often find that the best money they can spend is on evaluations. For my own son, I was able to use health insurance to pay for them. That is not always possible. In fact, I don't think it's possible right now with my son's health insurance, but because he has epilepsy, and is on all kinds of drugs for that, they were able to do evaluations, not explicitly for school, but they were very helpful for school at the time. So I think that trying to figure out what, I guess to state it really simply, one of the most important things to getting your child help is to understand why they need help and what kind of help they need. And so that's why we're spending a lot of time talking about evaluations, so that you can try to make sure you're understanding your individual child's needs.
That's right. And in case I didn't mention this before, the process again to request evaluations is in writing. You can write to your school, you can write to the Committee on Special Education, and it does not have to be a complicated note. It can just say, hello, I'm the parent of name of child, date of birth, currently at PS, whichever, and I would like an evaluation for physical therapy, occupational therapy, assistive technology, a full set of evaluations. If you find something online that reflects your child's needs, and now you know your child needs a neuropsychological, a neurological, a psychiatric evaluation, you can make that request in writing, and the Department of Education has to respond. Now, let's talk a little bit about independent assessment authorizations, or IAA. If you disagree with the Department of Education's evaluation, or they don't do that within a specific time frame, a 60-day time frame from your request, you can ask that they pay for the assessment. To request an independent assessment authorization, you can ask the principal, superintendent, special education, the Committee on Special Education. The Department of Education has 10 days to approve your request or deny the request with an explanation in writing, so that it's resolved relatively quickly. You don't have to use Department of Education providers. If you have an independent assessment authorization, you can use your own provider, but you can also use Department of Education contract providers. Okay, I think that's that for this one. Yeah, let's go to the next one. So let's talk a little bit about special education recovery services. Now, so special education recovery services are COVID-based specialized instruction and related services that are offered by schools in addition to a student's IEPs mandated services. So these are separate from what the IEP recommends. These are school-wide services that are offered to students with IEPs. The purpose is to help close gaps brought on by the pandemic's disruption to learning. Recovery services supplement but do not replace a student's IEP. So these are extra services offered to students with IEPs in public schools, and again, to make up for the impact of remote learning during COVID, should include missed services but can include additional services even if these services were not missed. So for example, if you missed the 3 months of speech therapy, recovery services could include speech therapy, but it can also include other services such as counseling services or um, uh, instructional services, instructional supports, even if these were not listed on the IEP. Because the purpose of them is not to provide the individualized supports and instructions that are mandated on the IEP, but to help as a school-wide program, students who fell behind catch up to close that gap. Recovery services do not waive your right to additional services. So if you have on the child's IEP that they should have received 3 months of speech therapy and they did not receive 3 months of speech therapy, and you'd like those 3 months of speech therapy to be offered by allowing and accepting recovery services where perhaps speech therapy was offered or other services were offered, you are not now giving up your right to claim those 3 months of speech therapy. You're just getting additional services because COVID was very disruptive and a lot of children fell behind. So that is the purpose of recovery services. Just please remember that this is not to make up for everything that was lost. This is to try to close that gap. So what is the process for recovery services? So the school is supposed to, or was supposed to, meet with parents of children who have IEPs in the fall or winter, although we've heard that because of Omicron, there were some disruptions in these meetings. Still, meetings should have happened. And the school should have talked to the parents about how remote or hybrid services affected the specific student. And then the school is supposed to offer recovery services at the meeting. So they should explain what type of services they're offering, when they're offering the services, how often your child is going to get those services, and then follow that up in writing, giving you a summary of what they had recommended. What if there was no meeting? Even now, you should ask for a meeting with the school to discuss recovery services because they're available school-wide, and if your child has an IEP, they should be entitled to that. Now, when are recovery services offered? So recovery services are offered individually by school. So each school has created a plan, and special educational recovery services, which is what you see on the screen as SERS, S-E-R-S, could be offered before or after school. They could be offered in a Saturday program. And interestingly enough, even though the Department of Education has gone in person and there are no remote programs in general, you can get SERS offered remotely. If the scheduling doesn't work, you can certainly ask for a different time or day. If the services themselves are not working and you need something completely different, there is an email address, which we will share later on, which is SERS, S-E-R-S, at schools.nyc.gov, which is a dedicated email address that deals with special education recovery services. And you can email there to say either you didn't get the service, you didn't get SERS services at the school, you want a different date, a different time, a different type of program, and you can always copy special education at schools.nyc.gov and copy us, we can track it too, to ask for what your child needs. And that, I think, is the bottom line of it. Like, there are dedicated email addresses, and of course, we're also here to try to help you navigate this part of the process. You can ask for what your child needs. You don't have to accept something that doesn't work for your child just because it's available. There's funding available through SERS to offer these types of supports. But if they don't work, you can also tell the school, look, these services don't work, and you issue a related services authorization letter so that I can find a different type of support for my child because of the loss that they experienced in COVID, and take advantage of these email addresses to be able to get the Department of Education documenting this and also to try to offer those supports and services. Kim, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
I would just add there's a lot of questions coming in, and we do have a lot of slides to get through. But the typical theme of what's coming in is I was not offered what I needed, or, my child's only getting services from the ELA teacher, but he or she needs math help, things like that. Absolutely. We're hearing that a lot. I mean, the big problem with SERS, or Special Education Recovery Services, is the DOE had this big pot of money, gave it to schools and said, here you go, do something. But schools were very limited in their ability. What I should say instead is it varied widely from school to school, and they may not have had a math teacher available. That does not mean if your child needs a math teacher to work with them because they fell behind in math during COVID, not an uncommon situation, that you shouldn't be able to get it. You may not be able to get it from your school. And this is a situation where hopefully your school will help you do this, but if not, you should definitely go up the chain. And we will talk about what we mean by the chain later. But I think, as Liliana said, emailing sers@schools.nyc.gov now, absolutely asking for recovery services. We'll talk in a minute about compensatory services, but this is a time to ask. This is not a time to see, well, maybe it'll work out. This is a pot of money that's available for a limited time. I think one of the problems for many schools is they didn't have the teachers to staff, so they weren't able to use that money, but DOE Central has it. So please be very specific in what you're asking and what the problem is, and keep asking up the chain. Yep. And so this next slide is what we're trying to do here is explain the framework, also some of the practical issues, and then what schools were told, which may vary widely. For example, at my son's school, I was able to get some related services, but no sets. They just didn't have sets available. It wasn't something that I particularly felt strongly about, but I think many of his classmates did. So it's something that it's very individual by child, and it's very individualized by school. So ask for what your child needs and ask in writing now.
Yep, and I think I'm going to cover a couple of questions in here, and that is that every child with an IEP is entitled to recovery services. And again, this is a school-wide effort to close the gap. It is different from compensatory services, which is something that has always existed under the IDEA, which is that idea that if you didn't get the services appropriate services that your child was required to receive that were on the IEP, you can recover those services. You can get those services through compensatory services. So recovery, you have to think about it as just COVID-based. It's a new structure school-wide for all students with IEPs. And compensatory services, which we will talk about later on briefly, has to do with what specific services your child was supposed to receive and what services do they have to get now to be where they were supposed to be had they received the services in a timely fashion. So it's not just one-on-one services, it's just what happened that they lost these services that were mandated, and now what do you need to make sure that they are where they were supposed to be. Okay, so it's a little tricky. I told Kim earlier this week that I think of recovery services sort of like bulk services for everyone, with of course some specialties here and there. And compensatory services are very individualized, specific to your child and your child's specific needs. Okay, so we'll talk about that in just a second, but let's talk a little bit more about what recovery services were supposed to look like in school. So the blue link on top, when you get these slides, will take you directly to the guidance to schools for recovery services. But typically, the schools were told that they needed to prioritize certain students to receive services first. So tier 1 students were students with greater need, followed by tier 2 students who were students who still had experienced a loss in progress because of COVID, but not as great as those in tier 1 and then tier 3, of course, students who had fallen behind and also needed additional services, but not as severely and not as in need as tier 1. So the schools were supposed to create 10 to 13 week cycles so that students would to allow for flexibility in scheduling, and then they would stagger the start time of the tiered services. So if you were a tier 1 students, you were supposed to be in the first 10 to 13 week cycle and get 20 hours of sets and 10 hours of related services, and that was supposed to start November 15. Don't quote me on that. It could be November 1st, but I think it's November 15. And then if you're in tier 2, the 10 to 13 week cycle for you with 16 hours of sets and 8 hours of related services would have started in December 15th, and then tier 3 would have started in January 15th. But we know that didn't necessarily happen in that way. The groups that were set for students to use their I keep getting stuck on this, the recovery services. I keep trying to say compensatory services, so I'm sorry if I'm pausing. But for the recovery services, we're supposed to be small groups with no more than 6 students. Health paras were supposed to be offered, and other paras as determined by the student need. And transportation was also supposed to be offered, which I think is the next slide. Let's just do that one just a minute. Okay. So if the services were in the weekend or after school, or if disrupted the typical way in which a student would attend school, a student was supposed to be able to get busing if they needed to get busing to go home to and from recovery services. If you didn't get busing and your child needed busing, you can ask the Department of Education to pay you back for transportation costs if busing is on the IEP but was not provided. Now, if busing was not on the IEP and was not provided, there's still a bit of a gray line, but there's no reason why you shouldn't ask anyway. Okay. Now, what if my child needs more or different services than what the recovery service is being offered, than the recovery service has been offered in school? And we alluded to this a little bit earlier. You can ask the school for more or different services to make up for remote learning. Now, remember, this is to make up for remote learning. This is not compensatory services, which is to ensure that your child receives the appropriate services they need to make progress as listed on the IEP, right? You can ask for an IEP meeting to request compensatory services to make up for remote learning. So if your child lost the 3 months of speech therapy and you'd like to recover that time, make that request as soon as possible. You have 2 years. They just extended the time frame, right? From March 15th on to make the requests for compensatory services for services that were lost during COVID. There's a statute of limitation that allows parents to recover up to 2 years from the time they knew or should have known that there was a failure, a denial of service, or improper services being offered. So the sooner you make the requests for services, the more likely it is that you'll be able to cover the entire time that they failed to receive the services during the COVID disruptions. Okay. So you can ask for an IEP meeting to request compensatory services. You can email SERS, SERS at schools.nyc.gov, or call 311 to ask for additional services to make up for remote learning. And finally, you can use your due process rights. You can request an impartial hearing to request compensatory services. Remember, these are the individualized services that were recommended for your child in the IEP, or that your child needs to be able to be where they were supposed to be had they received the services that they didn't. Okay, now it sounds a little complicated, but hopefully that we can answer some questions now. Kim, did you want to add anything to what I said just before?
No, I think that's right. I think there are a lot of questions coming in. A lot of them are individualized, which I completely understand. I think probably the best thing to do is to go through some of the next slides. And I'll go through we have a whole section on IEPs and programs, and then due process. It sounds like many people's questions may be a bit on due process and what to do with that. Also, in terms of one of the reasons why we're going through the different kinds of programs and how an IEP meeting goes is obviously if you can work it out with the school and reach a common understanding of what your child needs, that's the easiest path. And also if you have an understanding of what services are available in the DOE, which is why we're going to go through the continuum, we hope that helps you advocate for what your child needs, because you may know there's a problem. If you were able to get good evaluations, or you're really clear with what's going on with your child, That's great. But then the next step is knowing what tools are available in the DOE. I think the one question we didn't touch on at all is someone asked, are these available for private schools or only for DOE public schools? They are, right, the SERS, as far as I know, are only for DOE public schools. They are supposed to be coming out with something for charter schools. Private schools should be offering you something as well. Certainly the compensatory services and asking for something to make up for time that was lost during COVID is under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It's a federal right to get what your child needs to progress in school if your child has a disability and has an IEP. So you absolutely do have the rights of going up through due process. That is tricky in a private school if you're suing for it every year. And I would, if you're suing for it every year, because I think one of the questions was on Connor's cases or that situation where it's not an approved school, I would definitely recommend talking to your attorney. It is a tricky calculus to figure out. Okay, so I guess we're going to hold questions for right now because we're running a bit behind. But I am going to try to go through the next slides, and we promise we will stay at the end. So if you have a burning question now and can wait, please do. Okay, so IEPs. This you probably do all know. It sounds like most people here are pros at IEPs already, although there's a bit of a range from what I can see from the questions. But I think one of the most important things to remember about IEPs, and I've been doing this for a long time, but it's easy to forget, is that they're supposed to be individualized. So anytime a school says, oh, well, we don't have that here, they're not fighting that your child might need it. They're just saying they don't have it, but it's supposed to be about your individual child, not the school. And that's something where always keep in mind that school is part of a much larger system that has different resources, so you can ask for it. During COVID, and including now, a lot of IEP meetings are done virtually. They used to be done by phone. So you can ask to have an IEP meeting that's a Zoom or something like that. IEPs are legally binding. So that's one of the reasons why the DOE came up with the recovery services. For lots of reasons, many students did not get what was on their IEP during COVID. And that's a problem. So the idea with it is to try to come up with something that would help students get back on track. IEPs are good for a year. It's not like they expire at the end of the year. They're still in force until the next one, but they should be reviewed annually. I think I just covered this, but it's one of the most important points, that IEPs are supposed to be based on a student's needs, not a school's resources. And finally, keep in mind that the IEP team includes you as a parent. So you can slow things down. You should have all the same information that other people have, and your voice should be recorded and listened to at the meeting. So some tips for IEP meetings. It's really important to ask for any reports or evaluations before the meeting. I can tell you from personal experience as a parent, that is not the place you want to be combing through a complicated report that's raising your blood pressure. You want to read that the night before, highlight it, go in prepared to talk about it. And one of the things that I would do at my son's school is make the rounds and go to all the related services providers and the special ed teachers and say, hey, there's an IEP meeting coming up. Did you do any reports, anything new? Not in a adversarial way, but just to try to make the meeting as efficient as possible. You should sign and get a copy of the attendance sheet. Now that's tricky if you're doing it virtually. If you can figure out how to screenshot a Zoom meeting, that's good. If you're actually at an in-person meeting, I often just take a picture of the attendance sheet with my phone, unless I really know everybody who's there. Finally, it's really important to get a draft of the IEP meeting. Usually you don't get one at the meeting. You are supposed to get a copy of at least the program pages, but most people don't. But get a copy of it and look at it. You may find things that were mistakes in there, or things that are different than what was discussed, and you want to correct it if possible before it's finalized. And certainly once you get a copy of the finalized IEP, and keep following up until you get one. You really should get one within a week or so of the meeting at the longest. Read through that, make sure it looks right. I know they're boring. I know they're dense language, not parent friendly, but it is really important to read them and make sure you know what it says. Okay, so there's a lot of important sections in the IEP. I think I'm going to skip over this because I do want to leave time for um, lots of questions that people had. We do have other trainings on special education on our YouTube platform. I think the one question that came up was on AT services in the chat. One thing I would say with that is, or assistive technology, and they were asking about, can I get training? You should get training. Getting a device you don't know how to use, your child doesn't have to use, is a waste of a device. And in fact, there's a section on the IEP where you can write in AT training. So that's something you should ask for. Okay, so thinking through how to sort through all these papers, you have your evaluations, you have your IEP. I think one of the first things to think about is stepping back. And this is actually easier to say than to do, especially if things have not been smooth sailing at your school and things are tense, is to think about, well, what does your child need? Are the evaluations correct? Is the problem that you really need new evaluations? What should the IEPs say? Is it describing the needs accurately? Does it recommend the right program? So for example, for that student who got a new assistive technology device, does it recommend and have a plan for how anybody's going to get trained on using it? It sounds like no, but that should have been in there. So sometimes the problem is the IEP doesn't reflect what everyone knows the child's needs are. That was actually a pretty common theme in some of the questions I was reading before. And then another section is thing to think about is your child getting what's on the IEP? Now, sometimes that's hard to tell. I'll go through in a second what's going on with that. And you certainly should ask and try to keep track of it. But if your child is not getting what's on the IEP, make sure you're asking. Sometimes you may need a new school if they don't have that class program, or you may need extra services. They didn't have an occupational therapist for the first half of the year. You're going to need some makeup OT and something to help your child with that. And finally, is the program working? So let's say you think the IEP says the right thing, your child's getting what's on it, but you're still feeling like there's a disconnect. Sometimes the issue is the teacher doesn't have the right skills or training. So you may have, the parent who wrote in and said that they were getting special education recovery services from the ELA teacher. Something we've heard is somebody getting special education teacher support services or tutoring, essentially, from somebody who is not specialized in what their child needs. Their child has dyslexia and they're getting tutoring from the math teacher, or their child has dyscalculia and they're getting tutoring from the reading specialist. That's obviously a mismatch. It's not that you're not getting what's on the IEP, it's that it doesn't make any sense. So trying to think through all of these things, we're just trying to help you break down what the problem is so you can be the most efficient in solving it. Finally, one thing, it's hard enough to do this if your first language is English. It's a lot of not very parent-friendly language to read in evaluations and IEPs. It's even more tough if English is not your first language and you don't speak English fluently. So you absolutely do have, under federal and state law, rights to get things translated, including report cards and IEPs. You should ask for that. The DOE has gotten more funding. They've upped their game in terms of trying to translate things. You also have a right to interpretation, professional interpretation. They should not be asking a parent to bring their older child in to translate or to interpret for them. That's not what should happen. And they should be translating and providing interpretation for their most common languages. If you have any problems with that, you should contact the DOE at the hello@schools.nyc.gov or call them at this number. And that's a really important right. Okay, so going to the continuum of services, the least restrictive is obviously general education with supports and services. Then moving up from that is ICT, where there's a special ed teacher and a gen ed teacher. I would say 10 years ago, this was not so common. Now it's probably one of the most common classroom types you see in schools. And then moving up from that, there's a special class in a community school. Sometimes that's called self-contained. And you see that in different ratios. The first number here, the 12 to 1 plus 1, the 12 in these ratios, or the 15 are the number of students. The next number is teachers, and that plus 1 is an aide, typically to help with behavior or attention issues. And then from that is District 75 inclusion in a community school. That's something where a student who really benefits from inclusion but needs more support can get more specialized support. Then moving up from that, there's District 75, which is all students with disabilities and in a range of different programs. Then there's non-public schools. This is something where you can get this on your IEP if it's a state-approved non-public school. If it's a non-approved non-public school, you'll need an attorney most likely to sue for it. And unfortunately, you have to sue every year. We found many parents do have to sue to get the non-public school, at least the first time. For a student who's really in danger and having a hard time, even at home, then there can be residential placement. And finally, something that's typically seen as the most restrictive, although during COVID, I think it's a little bit different, is home instruction, which they now call medically required instruction. So that's something where, because of the student's health needs, they need to get instruction at home. Okay, and then some specialized programs we want to highlight for people that are outside of that typical continuum are if your child needs a bilingual class, that's something that's done centrally. If your child needs and is on the spectrum, autism spectrum, and an ASD Nest or Horizon program could work for them. That's a small, either inclusive or segregated classroom, but where everyone in the classroom has autism, and you should have a teacher that's specially trained to support those students. That's that kind of class. You're going to apply for that centrally. ACEs is a similar type of program for students with intellectual disabilities. And finally, if your child uses a wheelchair or a walker and needs an accessible school or has a disability where they can't take steps, there is a process to ask for a school that can accommodate your child's needs. Okay, so state-approved schools, I'm just going to touch on this really quickly. I think I mentioned you need to have a defer to CBST or NPS program on your IEP. How that works, if you manage to get that on your IEP, is there's a central-based support team that's supposed to help find a school. In our experience, as much as possible, we recommend that parents try to find a school themselves, because you're going to do a much better job at trying to find the right fit. And there's a list of schools that's available online. To get a non-public school, you really need to be able to show that your child's needs can't be met in a public school. And these are schools that specialize in meeting particular needs. Okay, so another thing to keep in mind is in any one of these programs, some of the things that really help students progress are supports and services outside the classroom program, like AT or paraprofessionals or related services, or SETS, which is teacher support services. So these are something that you should think about. You could get them in any setting, and sometimes they can help support a child. Okay, one question that comes up a lot is, well, okay, my child has all these supports and services and their IEP is, tailored to their needs, but are they actually getting it? It's something that when I first started in the school system as a parent, I was like, well, how do you not know? I was in a school that had a very open door policy. I was in the classroom all the time. In fact, you're expected to be there. As he got older and I felt myself not being as welcome, I started realizing how very easily it could be that my son could not be getting his SET services or his OT services, and I might be the last to know. That obviously shouldn't be the case, but it can be. One thing that you can look at, this is brand new this year, and it's on the school quality reports. If you click under supportive environment, which is a tab right in the middle, it shows you, now this is not for your individual child, but it's for the school as a whole. What percentage of students are getting what's on their IEP? Obviously, this school, it's the New York City high school, is having a real problem right now because only 38% of students are getting what's on their IEP. They're doing slightly better in related services, but that's not so great midway through the year. But it's something that you can look at just to check and see, how is my child's school doing with providing services? It does not mean that your child isn't getting services. Your child might be one of the lucky 38% that is. But if you see a stat like this, it's certainly worth starting to ask about it. Eventually, we hope that on that New York City student account page that we showed you in the beginning, they will have some compliance information there. Right now, the only thing you can see is the provider who's assigned to your child, but you can't see are they actually getting the services on an ongoing basis or not. Okay, another question that comes up, now we cover this a lot in our, I'm sorry, there's somebody at the door, probably Amazon for a different appointment, is how do I know if my school has a small class or an ICT? That's also on the school quality reports. I apologize about the dog. And you can look here and see, there's links in the slides to see, okay, well, this school has some students in ICT, and most students with disabilities are not in gen ed, for example. That's important to know, especially if you're applying to a school and you're interested in, a self-contained setting, and you look on this and see they don't seem to have one. It doesn't mean that they can't create one, and it's certainly they are supposed to create one, but it's good to know going in. If you really love this school and you want to fight for what your child needs, you legally have a right to have them create the program that's on your child's IEP. But other times you may want to be at a school that has a bit more of a track record with that type of program. Finally, another thing to look at is class size reports. These are really detailed. This is kind of the most advanced, but it is good to know, how do you research what's happening in your child's school or at a school that you might want your child to go to. This is, you can click on this link. It's very detailed. It's this huge spreadsheet. So make sure, you're on a device that can open it up. And you can see how many sections there are. So for example, this school has a lot of self-contained classes. And it looks like this may be for a high school, given the sizes there. That's great. Many high schools don't have that many self-contained classes. You can see what size the classes are, what they range from. So I don't have the headers here, but it goes from average, minimum, and maximum number of students in each class. Okay, and finally, I think there was one question about this in the Q&A, but we have heard that Summer Rising is coming back this year. Unfortunately, from a lot of what we heard, it was not a smashing success for students with disabilities last year. We're hoping for better this year. One encouraging sign is on the DOE's website, where I would encourage you to go and check for updates regularly. This year, it does say supports are available for students with IEPs, including paraprofessionals, and that at least for K-8, it says they're working out details on transportation. So that's good. Last year, they did not get transportation together for most students in Summer Rising, and certainly paraprofessionals were an issue. It does sound like they are once again relying on community-based organizations. That's what CBOs means there, to provide these services. And of course, the problem is not all CBOs have experience with students with disabilities. So we're hoping that it's a little bit smoother this year for students. For high school, they are beefing up the Student Youth Employment Program, also a program that has not traditionally particularly individualized supports for students with disabilities, but I think they are trying. So I would ask early, and keep researching this, because it is a great way to try to get your child extra help. Okay, so the section that I think we have touched on a few times, because it's a big one already from the questions that are coming in, is what to do when you disagree with the DOE. Of course, the first thing to do is talk to your school. Start with the parent coordinator, the principal. Honestly, talk to anybody who you feel like is an ally there, and then talk to the principal as well. Up the chain from that is the district superintendent's office. You can talk to the family support coordinator or the district family advocate. There's something called the Borough Support Organization. No promises that they won't change their name in the next year, but that right now is the structure above a school and next to a superintendent that's, or I guess under a superintendent, that provides special education supports. And there should be somebody there called an administrator of special education. And they're supposed to help the school provide support. So example, if you're going to your school, the superintendent and the BCO and saying my child is getting recovery services, but they're getting from an ELA teacher and my child needs help in math, it's the AZ or the administrator of special education that would most likely be the person to try to line up a math teacher to help your child. If they weren't able to, you can ask for vouchers. Somebody asked about a RSA or a P4, P3 is the other thing in the Q&A. Those are vouchers that let you find a private provider and use the voucher to pay for them. I would say that many people find that they're better off just asking everyone they know, asking teachers at schools. The DOE lists don't always work. They do have lists online of people you can ask. They do have to be licensed in whatever you're looking for. So if you get an RSA for OT, in other words, a voucher for occupational therapy, you have to find an OT who's licensed in New York State to be able to use that voucher. We've had problems where people say that they're having trouble finding somebody. If that's the case, please reach out to Advocates for Children, and certainly also reach out to Related Services. I'm going to get to that in a second, and ask for help. Finally, DOE Central is a place you can go. You can always email specialeducation@schools.nyc.gov or call this number and ask for help. Now, if that doesn't work, you can go to a formal dispute resolution. Mediation is where you're just trying to talk something through. Both sides have to agree, and a mediator can come to the school and talk things through. We found that sometimes this can be wonderful. It can be a way to really clear the air, especially if you're in a situation where you want your child to stay at that school, but you want to resolve something and you're finding things getting very tense. This is something that can really help. It can also be faster than an impartial hearing. Unfortunately, everybody still has to agree at the end of it. So the mediators are skilled at trying to get people to agree, but if they can't, you may need to go to an impartial hearing. An impartial hearing is a legal proceeding. We did get a question about, or is it now done by the DOE? That's not true. There is a very publicized change from the impartial hearing office that's in downtown Brooklyn, and it's moving to OATH, the Office of Administration and Trial Hearings. Oh my goodness, I don't know if I have the acronym totally spelled out right. But it's basically a city agency that handles a lot of different administrative hearings. There's a lot of concern about how this is going to go. One thing I would say is, at least from what I've seen so far, they are hiring people with special education experience. So our original fear that you could have somebody who's handling a Con Ed bill hearing your special education case, that's not the situation. But we don't know very much about it yet in terms of how it's going to play out. To go to an impartial hearing, it is a formal proceeding. You certainly can go to it on your own. But it does involve witnesses and documents, and you get a written decision at the end that you can appeal if necessary. Finally, before we get to questions, we want to let you know we do have a webinar coming up. They have reverted back to the GED in New York State. For a while, it was something called a task. And this is basically for students that are having trouble graduating from high school and need an alternative way to do that. So we're going to have a webinar on that. And we have other webinars coming up too. So please sign up for our alerts, and we hope to see you at some of these other ones, especially the Summer Rising for people who are asking about that, and Related Services if that's an issue. Okay, Liliana, do we have a lot of questions? I have not been looking at the Q&A.
I've been answering a few. Let me see if there's a couple that are still left open. Let's see. I think we covered a lot of them. Somebody, perhaps if you can repeat what RSA stands for.
Oh,
somebody
I'm
had
sorry.
A question.
Yeah, and we should have had a slide on that. I thought we did, and I just realized going through it, we did not. RSA
Right.
stands for Related Services Authorization. It basically means for a related service, which is physical therapy, occupational therapy, PT. It could actually theoretically be for a para or for something else as well. It's a voucher where you can use that voucher if somebody agrees to take the voucher and be paid by the DOE at the rate that they have. You can use that voucher to get services. If you're finding somebody and they want a higher rate, you can ask for that. We find that especially true with a different kind of voucher called a P3. Somebody said P4 in there. I don't know why it's called P, but or maybe program, I'm not sure. but it's for a special education teacher to work with your child. And so that's something where the rate for that, I think all of the rates for these are a bit below market value or a lot below market value in some case. So for that one, if you're not able to find anyone for that rate, you can just keep track of everyone you've asked. It's really important to be able to show, I've called 6 people and nobody's available to do it. Then you can ask for an increased rate. And that's something that certainly please reach out to us, call our helpline, email us at info@advocatesforchildren.org, and we can try to help you if you have not been able to find somebody to work with your child. We're finding that a lot of schools if they don't have the services available. So for example, there were no related services at my son's school to work with my son, even though that was a piece where he really didn't get his PT and OT during the pandemic, and he really needed them and fell behind because of that. And they're online, my son is quadriplegic, online PT, it just didn't cut it. So we needed a lot more help, and they didn't have a provider who was available to provide the services there. On top of that, trying to get him home from school without busing, it wouldn't work, but they gave us an RSA to try to get services. It's a lot of work for a parent to find somebody. On the other hand, for some parents, it actually can work. If you find a provider you like, they can come to your home, or if they're a neighborhood provider, you might be able to bring them there. So you have more control, but also more work. We do have a poll. If you can take the poll, we really appreciate it. We're going to put it up now. Liliana, if you could do that, that would be great. And it helps us a lot with funders. It also, it will help us know what else we should be doing.
I am looking for the poll, Kim.
Oh,
in the meantime, there is a theme to some of the questions, which is that either there's not enough providers. Thank you. Hold on. Here it is. Launch. Okay, there's a poll. So as you mentioned, it's hard to get providers right now. So the question is, the general gist of the question is, if there are no providers, if you're not getting services because there are no providers, or the providers that are available are not qualified to offer the services that they're providing, so what do you do? What are you entitled to? What remedy do you have? Relief?
I mean, that's tough. I think you have 2 choices, right? You can, if you are not able to find somebody, and I would be really creative. One of the things I've done to try to find related services for my child, for example, is I call private schools in the area. And I say, do you have a PT on private special ed schools? And ask if they have anybody. I've found amazing people that way, because there's no restriction on them working with my child, and they sometimes like to make a little extra money at the end of the day. And that can really work out. But if you're hitting a wall and you can't find somebody, the DOE is not allowed to say, oh, well, too bad you couldn't find somebody, that's on you. An RSA or a P3, any of those vouchers, the DOE still has the ultimate responsibility for finding you someone. And that's something where you can reach out through related services at schools.nyc.gov, go up the chain, ask for help in finding a provider. We have done, and also reach out to Advocates for Children, because I've escalated those cases myself. By escalated, I mean, I email somebody in Central DOE and say, this student's been without speech for an entire year. This entire school in the Bronx doesn't have a speech therapist. What are you able to do? And they often have been able to find somebody to come to the school when we're escalating it. So it works out. You know, of course, with that, you don't have control over who the person is, but it's much better than not getting anything from your child, or it should be. So that's something to know. You can try to be creative in finding somebody if you get a voucher, but also know that you can and should ask the DOE for help.
And remember, not having the services, not having personnel to offer the services is no excuse for not offering the services. You continue to be entitled, your child continues to be entitled to the services that are recommended on their IEP. And if you're going to the IEP meeting and the school tells you, well, it looks like your child really does need that service, but we have no one to offer it, that is also no excuse to not include the needed services on the IEP.
Someone asked if your child is approved for a paraprofessional in a mainstream setting, but there's no paras available, That's something I've lived very personally this year. It has been a rough year for students who need paras. The DOE is responsible for doing it. You certainly can ask for an RSA for a para if you know anyone, that you should be able to get them paid for. They also do have contract agencies, so that if you know somebody who might be able to act as a para, you can ask for that. I think paraprofessional salaries are very low. The benefits are pretty good. For a while, they had no one in the para pool. Now they do, but of course it needs to be the right person. So that absolutely has been an issue. And anything where you're really hitting a brick wall and your child, you're asking for these things, but nobody is getting them to you. First of all, this is easy to say and sometimes hard to do, but keep track of it. Keep a calendar, keep track of emails, however you want to do it. And then ask the DOE for help, but ask us for help, because we've found that when we sent up a number of cases involving paraprofessionals and nurses and busing this year, actually my colleague who sits next to me at work sent up a lot of those cases, and she got really good results most of the time. I wish I could say that parents advocating on their own got the same results. We did not see that always, but it is something where, certainly try with the DOE, and if it doesn't work, reach out to us and we'll see what we can do. Somebody was asking, is a para for medical reasons? Is it an accommodation or related service? It's a related service that your child needs to, be involved in school. And yes, somebody was asking, I'm sorry, I'm saying yes because I'm reading it. Somebody was asking that they want a P3, or they said R3, but it's actually P3, YP, I don't know. But for a math voucher, if your son is receiving ineffective services, certainly, I think you would want to document why the services aren't working. But absolutely, we've seen people being matched with special educators or even general educators who absolutely don't have the proper training to provide the support that a student needs. That's something that, if you're able to document that, that's a very clear case to ask for something else. There is I'm sorry, I don't have the link right here, and I end up Googling it myself every time, but you can look up to see what license a teacher has. If you look up NYS or New York State teacher certification lookup, and of course you have to know the person's first and last name, you can put that in and see, are they licensed in math? Are they licensed in high school? Are they licensed in whatever? And that's a place you can start if you feel like it's not working. And somebody else was asking, my child isn't receiving OT. Certainly go up the chain and reach out to Advocates for Children. That's not okay. And they should be providing you with makeup services. I think one thing to keep in mind is sometimes there's a difference between a legal violation and what you want to do about it. So for example, my son missed a whole lot of services and needed a whole lot of services to be made up, but he is exhausted at the end of the day. And there's no way we're taking him on public transportation to a school on the weekend. So trying to figure out what would be a makeup that would work for him is tricky. The one restriction on special education recovery services is they're not supposed to be done during school. If your child is missing OT right now, though, and that sounds like what that question was, they can do makeup services in school, but it depends on your child's schedule. Is that going to work, or are they going to miss a class if that happens? But I think trying to be creative and think about what might work, or at this time of year, thinking about the summer, and is there a way to make things up in the summer? And somebody asked, is this the same for D75? Absolutely. Of course, there's some differences in D75, but everything we've said is true for D75. I think one of the things that's obviously not true is looking up if your school has an ICT, although D75s do have some ICTs, but some of the things we were talking about are more specific to community schools, but almost everything we covered is true no matter what setting your child is in. Okay.
I think we can stop the recording, and if there are additional questions, we can get to it. For those of you who are still filling out the poll, we really do appreciate it. We're going to stop the recording now. And
And
thank you.
also, just
Go
one
ahead.
other thing, we are going, in case you missed the beginning, we are going to send it, sometimes takes a day or so. We are going to send a recording and the PowerPoint and a Google survey that allows you to fill out more open-ended questions. So I know some people put in, I want a training on assistive technology. You know, there's some more open-ended questions in there. What worked in this training? What didn't work? What you want to hear more about? We really do read every single one of those. So if you can't answer the Google survey, it's just a link. It's pretty short, but we really would appreciate it. So thank you so much, and good luck to all of you. I know this has been a tough year.
Thank you.